call to order the City of Oak Harbor Planning Commission regular meeting, April 25, 2017. Let the record show that Commissioners Pierce and Merriman are not present this evening. The next item on our agenda is the approval of the minutes of March 28. Do I have a motion?
I make a motion we approve the minutes.
Have a second?
Oh, I make a motion we approve the minutes.
Second?
I second.
Okay, there's been a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Minutes are approved.
And I'll abstain. I was absent.
Okay. Next item is public comment. The Planning Commission accepts public comment for the items not otherwise on the agenda for the first 15 minutes of the Planning Commission meeting. So I have one person that would like to comment.
One taker.
One taker.
Good evening. My name is Laura Reniger from the Oak Harbor Gary Oak Society. I have a packet for each commissioner to go along with my remarks. In your packet, you will find a brochure explaining the work of our group, a copy of Oak Harbor City Code 20.16, an informational guide for tree protection, and photos number 1 and 2. Upon reflection, it seems the current Oak Harbor City Code 19.66 on variances regarding Gary oak trees in place since 2005 is potentially being revised only to meet special circumstances arising from the Melrose Drive oak situation. Oak Harbor Gary Oak Society has been advocating for some time now that the city revise the current Gary Oak Tree Protection Code 20.16.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, excuse me. I don't mean to interrupt, but this is public comment for items not on the agenda. Are your comments speaking to item number D, the code change on, or are they broader?
A little bit broader, but within.
So the best place for those comments is actually when that particular item is coming up, as
Okay.
opposed to this is more of a general comment for something that's not on the agenda. So if you could hold them till then, that would be great.
Okay, absolutely.
All right, thanks.
Take a rain check on that. For just a few minutes, yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Do I have any other public comment at this time? If not, I'll close that part of our meeting. Item 4 is the public meetings. The first item is the amendment to the Oak Harbor Municipal Code, Chapter 19.75 rezones, and it's a public hearing. And Kak Kamak is going to walk us through this, senior planner.
You're on.
You're on, Kak.
Good evening, Kamak Senior Planner, presenting the amendments to Chapter 1975 rezones. So this is a code amendment that we shared with the Planning Commission a couple meetings ago with some information, and then we talked about it a little bit at the last meeting with some proposed language. And here we are with the official process of adopting or at least making a recommendation from the Planning Commission to the City Council and going to adoption with the proposed code. So since it's been a couple months, I'm going to just go through for folks that watch at home on some of these actions, just to go over why we're doing the code amendments, what's in the current code, and what's being proposed. So the changes initiated to this code kind of comes from our 2016 update and our change to the land use map. our original, or before the 2016 update, our land use map was on a 1-to-1 ratio. So changes to zoning designations needed a change to the comp plan land use prior to any rezoning that could be considered. And that was a long process. Sometimes it took a year, sometimes it took a couple years to do. And the primary reason why they had this 1-to-1 approach was to try and prevent spot zoning. For just kind of having a process so that the city considers every rezoning at a very broader scale than a property level scale. So in 2016, when we looked at amendments to the comprehensive plan and we looked at the land use, we discussed a little bit about the delay in time that property owners have to go through in order to change zoning classifications for their property, and came up with a better strategy, so to speak, to still be able to do land use planning from a planning standpoint, but also to provide some flexibility for property owners to be able to tweak their zoning slightly in order to accommodate to changing times in the market for what the demands may be, because it's not always consistent, it always changes. So once we changed the land use map from a 1-to-1 ratio to a generalized land use, then we had to kind of look at the rezoning code that actually implements it and see if it's in sync with the comprehensive plan land use procedures. And we saw that there was some inconsistencies and some requirements that were really from a long time ago that doesn't really apply and makes it still challenging, so we had to refine the code further for that. So this is just a graphic to kind of indicate, how the prior to 2016 update, how the land use and the zoning worked. We have in the previous land use map, we had low density residential, which converted to R1 single family, and then we have a medium density that did R2, and then we have a medium high density that did R3 commercial. 1-to-1 is what the ratio was, and so with the 2016 update, if I can get my clicker to work, a single land use category like a low intensity residential is implemented by 3 zoning categories, R1, R2, and R3, and so on. Like the industrial will be implemented by 3 zoning categories, and these zoning categories are existing, so no changes actually happened on the property. We just changed the planning tool with which we look at it. And so now you can rezone between R1 and R2 without having to do a land use change, and so that was what we wanted to accomplish, and so we need to amend the code slightly to allow that process to happen. So just looking at what the current code says in terms of changes, it was mainly designed around map amendments and contract zonings. So the language was addressed with a totally different intent. And a lot of the zoning requests required site plans to go along with it, which kind of made the process a little more complicated and required property owners to invest early into a change that could or could not happen. I mean, likely if the rezoning was not compatible with the surrounding land uses, they've invested now money and time into developing site plans, and so that didn't seem like it was a fair deal in that. So the current code had a quasi-judicial process with the hearing examiner, and then it had provisions for conditions and restrictions. It required an ordinance to go with all the conditions that gets attached to the property when you do it in that format. And then when that gets attached to the property, it makes redevelopment of that even more difficult as in future years. So it was just adding layers of complexity to the process. The proposed new language, we want to keep it simple. We want to completely replace the existing code because the old code was written with a different intent, and strike-through versions would have not worked really well. So it's just better to repeal the code and get a new code in. And it keeps the process of considering rezonings with the hearing examiner. That's how a lot of communities do. It's a quasi-judicial process, and the hearing examiner is the best qualified person to kind of look at these procedures. So we kind of kept that. It simplifies the review process. Not too many conditions and mitigation requirements. And the criteria are based on location and compatibility with the intended zoning classification. And if there are challenges with the particular rezoning, you can condition it through a development agreement. And I think the proposed code has these provisions in there. So, considering a code amendment is a type 5 process, and as mentioned in the pre-meeting, we're in the process of doing the SEPA review and comments, which is ongoing right now. We're going through the official process of looking at this code, so this is a public hearing. So for the Planning Commission today, we hope that you consider the code amendments and make a recommendation to the City Council. Based on your recommendation, we'll take it to the City Council. The tentative date is May 16th for that. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. If not, I would recommend that the Planning Commission conduct a public hearing, take public comments. We can address your comments after the public comments as well, or right now.
Okay, I have one question regarding the criteria, items number 1 through 6. Item number 5 ends its statement with an "and," so it's obvious to me that you have to meet number 5 and one of the items of number 6. Do you also have to meet all of the items 1 through 4 in addition to that? Or can you meet one of the items in 1 through 5?
They
And
usually are all of them.
must meet all 6 criteria?
Yes, it's not
Okay.
one. Yeah, yes.
Thank you for the clarification.
I think at this time, I'll go ahead and open the public hearing on this item. So I'm opening up the public hearing for public comment. Anyone in the audience have anything they'd like to share or questions? Seeing none, I'll go ahead and now close the public hearing, and we can discuss it if there's other things commissioners would like to question CAC.
I think the process that we've been going down, this pathway, this makes a lot of sense to, for streamlining. One of the things that we've all heard is it takes so long to get through government to get things approved, and I think this goes a long way to help streamline that. So that's my only comment.
Eric?
I'd like to make a recommendation that the City Council adopt ordinance number 1798 with the amendments to OHMC Chapter 19.75 rezones as proposed.
That's a motion.
I'll second the motion.
Okay. We have a motion, it's been seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Motion's passed. The next item on the agenda is the sign code. It's a public meeting. Ray Lindenberg, Associate Planner, will help us out on this one. He's been working on this for quite a few months now.
Seems like a while, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for having me tonight. I'm going to kind of go through the staff report a little bit. I'm going to skip over the background because we've gone through that a lot before. I shouldn't say I'm going to skip over it. I'm going to shorten the background. In a recent Supreme Court decision, the Reed versus the Town of Gilbert, the Supreme Court determined that the way that certain sign codes are structured is unconstitutional. You can't have the content of the sign be the basis of the restrictions that are upon those signs. So what we've done is gone through and attempted to come up with a new concept to regulate those signs based on how they look, what they're made of, where they're located, how large they are, things like that. So utilizing 3 criteria that the Supreme Court have come up with, time, place, and manner, those are going to be your key things for how you're going to regulate the signs. So when we were discussing as staff the implications of Reed versus Gilbert, we had a couple of or excuse me, we had several different options that we felt we could fix our sign code. 3 of those are kind of listed in your staff report. The first one being kind of a Band-Aid approach, where we go through and we remove certain words and change things around a little bit to try and make it work as it was kind of designed from the beginning. While that would fix the constitutionality issues, we felt that that was kind of not a great way to go about it, because there were structural issues with the code that make it a little bit difficult to understand. There's some repetitiveness in there that caused some confusion and things like that. So we felt that that probably wasn't the best way to go about it. The Association of Washington Cities came up with a model sign code that they had provided to cities to use or to kind of crib from if they wanted to. We took a look at that. We felt that that would fix the constitutional issues, but wouldn't necessarily be based on what the community standards and tradition kind of was in Oak Harbor. So we kind of set that idea aside. And then the third concept, developing a hybrid of this form-based idea that we'd come up with previously and developing that into the existing Oak Harbor Code and its traditions and standards that have been developed over the years, and also utilizing some of those AWC code portions that would help bring us into compliance with the court case. So that was our decision there, was to develop this kind of hybrid method of doing that and to move fully forward with the form-based sign concept. Following that, we did a draft of the form-based matrix, is what we've been calling it, and we've presented that to you in the past, and we've had discussions. We then went out to the community and solicited comments. We had an open house here in the council chambers, got a few comments from the community, and were able to include some of those concepts into a more polished draft, and then also include some of the text that has to go along with that matrix. Unfortunately, we can't do everything in pretty pictures. We do have to include some words in there to explain things. So that you'll see as you turn your staff report to the draft code. And what I want to do is kind of go through, compare and contrast with our existing code and what we have proposed, so you kind of understand the differences. And I did include our existing temporary sign section as attachment 3 on your staff report if you need to refer to that. The first thing that you'll notice that's different from the existing code is that the existing code refers to the different sign types by the content. Bad idea. The new one says we're going to refer those signs by their appearance, their size, their materials, and the manner that they're installed. Second thing is it includes a very similar list of guidelines and principles in 2 different locations. We were able to combine those into one list of guidelines, and that way we cut down on the repetitiveness, we cut down on the confusion, because you would go to one section, it would tell you that you have to do these 6 things, and you go to another section and tell you to have to do these 5 things, and they were all very similar. So we combined those. We didn't remove anything. We didn't change substantively what it's going to tell you to do. We just changed the way that we're telling you that. And then the last one, there's one more. Places sign types over several different sections. The old one put your sign types in different locations. It talked about construction signs and real estate signs, and it would skip over a section and talk about political signs. Again, talking about the content, but also putting it in different locations that made it rather confusing to determine what it was you were dealing with. This new proposed sign code puts all the sign types into the matrix. They're all in the same place. It's easy to thumb to it, see exactly what you're looking for. And then the last one, the existing sign code, the organization of the text includes standards for specific sign types in multiple different locations. Again, with the new sign code, we put those specifics all within the same place, putting them at the beginning. The general standards are all at the beginning. So if you read it linearly, you see all the general standards for every sign, and then you move on to your specific type signs, so you know exactly where you're going with that. We felt that that was a better way of going about presenting that information to the public and to staff, being able to explain it better to everybody. I think that was one of the key things about the old sign code, that as you add to ordinances over the years, they tend to become a little cumbersome when you have a little bit of repetition and changes here that didn't get reflected there and things like that. So what we have is we believe that this new formatting and wording and presentation will be easier for everybody to understand. The proposed temporary sign type matrix is divided into categories based on the size, material type, and location details. The signs generally correspond to known sign types. A sign that you may see today will be reflected graphically in the matrix. It won't be referred to as an open house sign or a political sign. It might be referred to as an A-frame sign or sandwich board or something along those lines, referring to it directly by the design of the sign rather than the message that's on it. Staff believes that these changes will allow the city to effectively regulate temporary signs without running afoul of the Reed versus Town of Gilbert Supreme Court decision. The new formatting should be easier to understand for the public and easier also to administer for city staff. As noted previously, the matrix does not represent an overhaul of how signs may be placed in the city. However, it does represent a change to how we're presenting that information. I want to make that perfectly clear. We're not trying to reduce the number of signs here. We don't feel that that's necessarily an issue unless through our discussion tonight and in the future we come to that conclusion. But rather what we're doing is we're trying to make it easier for people to understand what it is they can and can't do. So going into the presentation of the sign types, you see in your packet there, we have the matrix. You have the time, place, and manner clearly stated right down on the left-hand side. And then within those items are the different categories and the different restrictions and standards that go with that. And so we feel that that makes it very clear about what a sign is, how it can be displayed, how long it can be displayed, and all that. So that is the sign type matrix. I'm actually going to have you step back a little bit in your code there on attachment number 2 in your staff report is the proposed draft code. And as you can see there, when you start from the beginning, you have your general standards. General standards for temporary signs. We go through several different standards in there. That's what applies to all signs. The second category is additional standards for temporary signs that are on public property. If you choose to place a sign that's going to be on public property rather than in your own front yard or at your own business, these are the standards that go along with those types of signs. And then you have your sign type matrix, which is section 3, and that goes into the specifics of each sign type. There are several different sign types, as you can see there. And then finally, towards the end, we talk about special events and grand openings and anniversaries. We felt that that was still an important aspect of how signs are displayed. We don't want to restrict businesses from being able to do their special events and things like that. So we included that in there. We felt that this was a much cleaner way of doing it rather than kind of going back and forth in the code and having to flip back and forth in the pages. So what I'm asking for tonight, we'll get public comment, but I wanted everybody to take a look carefully at both of these sign codes, the new and the old, and think to yourself, if I was a business owner looking to get an advantage or try and find a loophole or something like that, what would I do? Because we want to hear about this. This is a concept that is relatively untested. I'm not aware that this sign form-based sign code has been applied anywhere else. So we want to make sure it's going to work and we don't have unintended consequences. So I'm asking everybody to play a devil's advocate and see if there's anything that we're missing there, essentially. From there, we will move forward in incorporating any of those needed changes, refining the text, refining the matrix if we need to, and then moving on to a public hearing, hopefully at your next meeting, and then moving on from there to go to the City Council for adoption. So I can entertain any questions that you might have.
I make the assumption, and I shouldn't assume, that you took signs like a real estate sign, and you looked at that, and obviously that's, it has a dimension on it, and that's
Yep.
where you come up with all these different sizes and shapes.
It is. And again, if there's something in there that you see that you think, gosh, that sign is really small, or that sign is way too big, for the standards of what, we've had in the past, or for what's kind of the prevailing market factor at this point. I know we had a discussion about the size of real estate signs, T signs, whatever you want to call them. So there's a little bit of wiggle room there as far as if we feel that, gosh, somebody wants to sell their house, maybe this sign isn't big enough for that. But you have to keep in mind that we can't restrict them from having a similar type sized sign that might say something else entirely. That's the restriction on content, and that's what we have to consider. So if there's an industry standard or something like that, in whatever industry it may be, let's take a look at it. Let's apply that and see if there are any unintended consequences, and if it's something that we can live with, then that's certainly something we can take a look at changing.
Couple of things. I noticed in the previous or current, I guess, temporary sign code, it talks about double-sided signs, and I didn't see any place in this new one where you specifically addressed double-sided signs.
Yeah, that might be something that goes into the general standards. Honestly, I kind of assume that they're all double-sided signs. That's probably a bad assumption.
Well, I think so too, but previously, you said, like, if it's 4 square feet, then it's 4 square feet on each side.
Yeah.
When you're starting to talk about a 4x8 piece of plywood where people can put it perpendicular to the street, and now it's 32 square feet on each side, I just think that needs to be clarified maybe.
Sure.
That's my personal opinion. And then the other one is, as I mentioned at the open house, the 4 square feet size for the real estate sign is smaller than what.
Yeah, and I thought that had been changed, but we'll fix that.
Thank you.
My comment, first one reflects the same thing that Hal just mentioned. I went and measured a few of the signs from our office. Most of them are 5 square feet for the type C.
Mm-hmm.
And then many homeowners like to have additional riders, maybe that says view or open house or, some other way to market the property.
Right.
That would add another square foot or so
Yeah.
for each one of those. So I think we may need a minimum of 5, maybe 6 square feet on type C.
I think my original intent on that after the open house was to change that to 6, and I thought it had gotten changed in here, but it did not. If 6 square feet sounds reasonable, like I said, it's going to be one of those things where we have to consider all signs that might go in there, because it might not say for sale, it might have a happy face on it or something.
So I would just not want to be out of compliance the day we bring this in and
Exactly.
have to go spend $1,000 to re-sign myself.
Absolutely,
So,
yeah.
Also on type D, I still have a challenge with one sign per residence or per lot. Those most often, I assume, would be used during the political seasons. And I find many residents within the city that are using multiple signs. They would like to advertise for their mayor of choice and their school board candidate of choice. And are we going to limit them to choosing which one they would rather support? And I think you mentioned that our objective is not to change the way that our citizens are using their signs, but just to regulate how that's done. I think we need to include additional uses in sign type D.
You have a recommendation as to the number, Mr. Mann?
Wow, that would be a difficult question. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to see 20 in every yard that I drove by. However, I have seen a lot of homes that will have 3 or 4 different candidates that they support. I don't think that's unreasonable to have 3 or 4 signs. And I don't know, maybe there's a way that we restrict to a total square footage rather than a certain number of each of these signs. I'm not exactly sure the best way to manage that, but when I look at the way that residents are currently using signs and we don't feel that it's a problem, I just have a problem limiting type D to one sign. It just doesn't make sense in my mind.
It's a good comment. We'll work on that. I've got an idea, but I'll see what Ray thinks.
I think where we're going, my thought process on that was, the political piece of it was one, we're no longer talking about content. Okay, we're talking about the sign.
Yep.
Okay, and that's where we get into trouble. you can't differentiate, politics, okay, from what brought this problem on to start off with. And that's what you're trying to do. Because if you say 3 signs for this, then that's 3 signs for everything. Is that right?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Within the category of temporary signs,
Correct.
yes.
Yes. And that's the hard part that I'm seeing right there, is that's the path we're going down. And I don't know how to, get the wiggle room in there, because the political piece of it is one issue that's kind of been like taboo in some respects. The sign codes have been enforced for the most part on everything else, but political campaign signs were always kind of left alone in some respect. But now with this new series, we're saying the size of the sign, but we can't talk about content, whether it be real estate. Okay, because if we go down that path and you say, okay, it's politics, well, it's okay for real estate as well. Or garage sale, or what have you. That's the problem I'm seeing.
That's definitely an issue. And one of the things that we can look at for a type D yard sign is maybe we need to have a time limit for all signs, because it used to be with your political signs that there was a certain amount of time that they were supposed to be out. Whether or not that was always followed was, but there was a certain amount of time, but you can't regulate that because you're regulating based on the content. However, if you want to say that type D sign can only be up for 30 days, then we can say that because we're talking about the sign. We're not talking about what the sign says. So that's a possibility too. The only issue we have with that is, how do we enforce that?
Well, in reading through all of this, I saw man hours. I saw enforcement hours. But again, the enforcement piece of it, if you limit to 30 days, most people and again, it's one of those situations where whether it be real estate, we're not talking content, but that's where you're going down this path. Is because if you can allow the sign and you say 30 days, that's the maximum 30 days. Then you got to change the sign.
Or move it.
Or move it.
Well, and the key thing is too, and the reason that we have different sign types, is the thought is that your typical yard sign that somebody's stabbing in the ground in their front yard might be of, let's say, lower quality, right? Whereas your typical real estate sign is probably going to be a higher quality sign because it's something that they need to reuse, that stays looking nice for a several year period, right? So we allow those signs to have no time limit maybe, and we have the stick them in the ground ones, maybe those have to be 30 days. Maybe that's how you handle that question, but again, it is an enforcement issue. At the same time, our enforcement is based on complaints. We're not driving around looking for signs now, and I don't anticipate that we would be doing the same then. And then the final question is, with the way the sign code is now, if you're posting signs in your front yard for your political candidate or whatever it is you're posting there, do we have a problem with that now? Is this something that we need to be tightening up because there's a proliferation of signs everywhere? That's kind of a question of philosophy we need to resolve as well.
A couple other quick comments. I notice just some interesting wording on type G, H, J, and K. It says that there's one allowed per parcel or per frontage, but then underneath that it says they must be at least 10 feet apart.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to kind of contradict itself in my mind. I can only have one and it has to be 10 feet apart. So was it initially that we were going to have 2 and they had to be at least 10 feet apart? Does that mean that we could have an alternative type of sign and it must be 10 feet from that type of sign? I just don't understand the language.
I think that statement, this might need some clarification in type G. Number one, that's for situations where, say, maybe you have multiple businesses in the same building, that rather than having a frontage restriction is maybe we need to change that to business. Because, for instance, say you have however many businesses in the Old Town Mall, right? And they all want to have their sandwich board out on Pioneer Way. This would only allow one of those businesses, whoever ran out first thing in the morning and put it out there would be able to get it. That's not fair. So we need to make that, and that might need to change to business or some other wording to allow for that. And I think that was the intent there, that if there are multiple ones, that they're not just all lined up immediately next to each other and causing problems.
Sure. It just seemed like a discrepancy in my
Yeah.
mind when I read it. My last comment, and then I'll get off of my little podium here.
Sure.
I don't see anywhere in here where we can regulate inflatable signs. I'm thinking about the ones that flop around as you drive by a business. Does that fit onto this matrix anywhere?
It doesn't, but there are blank spaces there. And I'm happy to draw something up for you. Seriously though, this code, I think, is uniquely suited to adding and subtracting as needed. If there's a great new sign technology out there and we want to make sure that people can take advantage of it, well, we've got these extra boxes. And if we want to talk about tube dudes and inflatable gorillas and whatever else, then by all means, let's stick it in there. Yeah.
Ray, on the commercial side of it, or retail, the banner, where does the 30 days come in? Why is it 30? Is that arbitrary, or?
That, I believe the intent, and I'm trying to read minds here.
Yeah.
I believe the intent was something along the lines of either business coming soon or, Joe's business while they're getting their permanent sign manufactured or something along those lines.
Okay. Well, let's just take a hypothetical or a
Sure.
real case. I have a storefront banner at my location at the South 7-Eleven store. And we do 60-day promotions, and we change it out every 60 days. I suspect by this standard, it wouldn't be acceptable to have the same sign for 60 days. Is that correct? Or?
No, there is a permanent primary sign present in your location, so it would be okay.
Because you consider that permanent because,
Well, your
just
permanent sign is your 7-Eleven sign.
okay, I got it.
What this is saying is that if there's, for instance, if there's an empty lot and you want to put a banner out there for Little League baseball signups, you can do that for 30 days. You can't have it up year round. If you're at a location where you have your business and you want to have a promotion, you can put that sign up for an unlimited time period because you're an established business there and it's not just sitting in an open field, either getting torn up or graffitied or run over or whatever.
One other thing, are you familiar with Windmasters? They sit on the ground. Is that considered like an A-frame? It's two-sided?
Do they spin around?
No,
Okay.
it's just, they call
Oh,
it
okay.
Windmaster because it doesn't.
They have springs on them.
Has springs on it, right.
Yeah, and that might be a situation where we include a new sign type, or that might be a situation where we need to say in here, and I don't recall if I put that in there.
Looks like it would be similar sized to a Type 8.
Yeah, and
Yes, that's correct. It is similar. But
I was going to, and I think I didn't because I was afraid I was going to throw our director under the bus by doing this, but that there might be a standard in there that says a sign that is significantly similar to
right.
something along that, to allow a little bit of flexibility, because we know that we're not going to be able to do all sign types here,
Yeah.
and that would be ridiculous to even try, so, yeah.
Is that statement that I hate that says, as otherwise determined by the director?
That's the one.
Yeah, I don't like that.
Thank you. Any other questions, folks?
Well, when your question about what kind of loopholes or things would somebody find, my mind goes to the fact that there's nothing that limits an overall square footage or number of types of signs that you could put out at any given time. If I was really trying to circumvent this system, I think I would have multiple different categories that allows me to put one of each of these for a certain number of time. And as long as I'm 10 feet apart with my multiple signs according to these categories, I could put out one of each of these signs on my frontage. The way that I read this. I can see that
Yeah.
being the easiest way to circumvent this
Sure.
for somebody. And that leads me back to thinking we need a certain number of square footage total per frontage or per 100 feet of real estate or some way to limit that. Otherwise, somebody could go through that loophole and just have
Yeah.
lots of different varieties of sign and not be breaking any code.
Right. And I would be happy to sit down with you or get your ideas on how that might work. My struggle with this is trying to regulate a business that has 50 feet of frontage versus a business that has 300 feet of frontage and
Understood.
17 different businesses within a building.
Yep.
There's a fairness issue there, and it's difficult, so I'd be happy to discuss for sure.
Before we leave this item,
Yep.
could you speak to the input that you got at the open house?
We talked about sizes of signs. Did you have a specific? I'm trying to. Okay. I think there was support for the idea of how it's going to work. I think that there's definitely some reading needed, some real digestion of it, because it is kind of difficult to sit and think about it. We had our Main Street director here, and I think she's concerned about, making sure that they're not kind of squeezed out because of their unique nature of where they're at. And we're trying to design this so that it's not being preferential just because you have a whole bunch of frontage on the highway versus having 25 feet of frontage on Pioneer Way. So I think there's a lot of balancing there, but I think we can make this work. I think it's
Sometimes I think
Definitely a
less
good
is more, and I don't think we have any real burning, blatant situations going on in the city.
yeah,
So
and that's
you got to be hopeful that, although just because you can't rule out everything
Right.
or include everything.
and we don't
I
want to.
suppose.
I don't think, and I'm a newcomer to Oak Harbor, but I don't think that this is the kind of place where we want to lock down signs to the point where it's like a resort town or something like that, where they're tiny and hard to see, and somebody comes along and picks up every sign that gets plopped out. So I think there's a happy medium there of being able to express your message as you need to, but at the same time maintaining safety and all that sort of thing too. So
I think one of the other big feedback things, if I may, at the open house
Yeah.
was the nonprofit concern.
yes, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. We do have a number of community organizations that do banners and A-frame signs for their various events in town, and so that was definitely something that they're concerned about, as far as being able to still do that. And so that's kind of one of those things that fits in that area between, is this go on a private property with the permission of a property owner, or is this going into a right-of-way area? And those are some of the balances that we're working on too.
Anything else? Tim? Well, thank you, Ray.
Thank you.
Be a long road.
Good job one more time. The next public meeting on our agenda this evening is, oh, yes. Yes, of course. Oh, absolutely. I'm sorry. Yes, absolutely.
Please forgive me, I didn't make enough, I didn't realize there were so many of you.
Oh,
So
that's
you
all
have
right.
to share.
We'll just share. Yeah, that's
We
fine.
can share. That'd be great.
Go ahead. No, you're fine.
I can see.
Hi, my name is Ken Fredericks, and I'm here to address only those signs that I think fall under the category of public right-of-ways. In other words, parking strips, public property where people are putting signs. And I have to compliment Ray for some of the wordage in the, what I got from him on the draft and the matrix. The first two pictures there illustrate one of Ray's points about ratty signs. And both of those signs are on Midway, and I took those this afternoon. So I think what I understand from this draft is that the traffic department or whoever's in charge of enforcement would be authorized to remove those two signs, specifically that banner that's wrapped around there and the one that's the barbecue one, which is in sad state of repair, I think. The third picture, again, is addressed in the draft report. It talks about putting signs in inappropriate places, and that picture is a picture that's in front of the college this afternoon. It's right in the median there, and it advertises the fact that the Maui Gate is going to be closed on the 29th. As I understand the proposal, those kinds of things in the middle of the street would not be there. It is a traffic hazard, and so I'm surprised, I'm glad that that's included in the right-of-way section there. The third picture is taken down there on Flintstone Freeway, and it shows the gun show thing laying in the ground there, and that's very typical of that type of construction. They fall down pretty darn quick, and my assumption is that when no one's attending to those signs, the city would be in a position to just remove it as litter. That's the way I read the rules anyway. The next two signs, one is a real estate sign at the corner of Heller and Crosby Road. It's an open house or for sale sign there. And then the other one is a picture, another gun show sign that's in front of, it's in the right-of-way in front of a piece of private property. As I read the rules, in order to put those signs in the public right-of-way in front of a piece of property, you would have to get permission from the homeowner to do that. And I applaud that 100%. The last thing I want to do is have a sign in front of my house for something that causes me heartburn. So if that is the intent of the draft, I compliment the drafters that we won't have those kinds of things. If they want to put it on private property, as you all were discussing, and I didn't realize how complicated private property was, fine by me. But the ones in the public right-of-way, to my way of thinking, are in a different category, and I applaud the drafter for saying, hey, you can't put it in the private right-of-way, the parking strip, whatever, without the permission of the owner. That's how I interpreted that, and I hope I interpreted it properly. The last sign, it was a yellow handwritten sign, and that one is particularly non-professional in my view, and as I understand the regulation, those wouldn't be allowed at all. They're just not professional. Quite frankly, that one almost looks like a scam. I mean, I certainly wouldn't pay any student $120K a year to be a student, so I kind of wonder about that one. But that's my particular favorite for today. The last thing that is not included in the draft, and I think it should be, it talks in the footnotes on the last page of the draft, something about hadn't determined whether or not we need permits for these things or not. I would encourage permitting on these for one reason, uniformity, but number two, I don't think we've discussed the liability of signs or that type of thing in a public right-of-way. So if you permit and so-and-so company wants to, it's approved to have it in there, seems to me the city ought to be an additional insured on the liability policy of that particular company that's placing it in the right-of-way. Anyway, that seems to be something that's lacking, and I would encourage inclusion in the draft, that the liability issue is first and foremost on the placer, not on the city. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ken. Any other comments about the signs this evening? Seeing no further comment, we'll carry on with the next item, critical areas ordinance update. That would be Senior Planner Dennis Lefevre. Dennis?
Yes, good evening,
Good evening.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission. Dennis Lefevre, Senior Planner. This is the next installment for the update process that we have been working on for the last several months for an update to our critical areas ordinance. Similar to CAC's presentation on the rezones, what we're looking at is, since the adoption of the comprehensive plan back in June of 2016, we're looking at major sets of our development regulations and making sure that they're consistent with that plan, the goals and policies that were established in that plan, and serve to implement those policies. Critical areas is no exception. In fact, it takes a pretty high profile when it comes to the state agencies, as well as how communities govern and maintain and regulate their critical areas. For some of you who haven't been on the commission very long, what I'd like to do is just a brief background on what we have done in the past. Our last major update for critical areas was in 2005. We had a couple of consultants assist us with that process. What was done at that time was utilize a state ordinance that was a model ordinance at the time. We followed that fairly closely, so the result was something that was very consistent with the state requirements. It met a lot of new things that were instituted back that session, I'll say, the 2005 update. Best available science. It allowed reasonable use exceptions in the code. It allowed creation of critical area reports be done for specific developments. So a lot of that was instituted into the 2005 update. My task, obviously, was to take it from the 2005 up until now, the 2017, and analyze what has been done in the last dozen years by the various state agencies that govern these critical areas, as far as updating terminology, methodology, all these types of things. So that was the method. That's basically what I have been engaged with the last number of months. What I'd like to do tonight is break my discussion into 4 basic parts, delve a little bit deeper into each of the chapters that we deal with in our Title 20 that establishes the critical areas. Look at each of the critical area chapters and kind of give an overview or a highlight, if you will, of some of the major issues that I have looked at as far as making potential revisions or things that may have already been addressed in some other mechanism. Section 3, I'd like to just talk about a consistency. We need to make sure, like I said, that these implement the comp plan policies as well as the shoreline master program policies, because that's another major document that has jurisdiction over, or at least jurisdictional boundaries that encompass critical areas. And then Section 4 obviously would be the next steps. What I'd like to also do is just open this up for open discussion. If you have a question at any time, please feel free to ask that. The first section, as I mentioned, definitions and general regulations. Definitions, basically, not much has changed. We have added a couple of definitions for fish and wildlife habitat conservation and fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. Both of those were recommendations from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So we had those inner definitions, but the wording was a little different according the state tweaked their definition a little bit. And then as far as general regulations, those are regulations. We have chapter, I think it's 2002, that deals with regulations that govern all of the critical areas, such as mitigation, sequencing, fencing. We have some minor amendments being proposed for those 2 items. We also deal with a reasonable use exception, variance procedures, forms and reports for all of the different critical areas in that section. So basically, those 2 areas aren't going to be tweaked a whole lot. Any questions on Section 1? Okay, now let's get into the Section 2, which I'd like to break down into the 5 basic critical areas that we are looking at. Frequently flooded areas. Fortunately, with the passage of our ordinance 1794 just a couple of months ago, that really carried a lot of the weight of the revisions that we were looking at for critical areas, dealing with frequently flooded areas. We adopted the most recent Federal Emergency Management Agency flood insurance rate map. which actually identified the 100-year floodplain, and actually the delineation was a little different, but we adopted that through our ordinance 1794. We also, as part of that ordinance, created language in the chapter which deals with frequently flooded areas, and that's actually entitled 17, chapter 17.20, to deal with the FEMA biological opinion. Back in 2008, the National Marine Fisheries Service, federal agency that deals with a lot of the sea mammals and fishery issues along our shorelines, had an issue with how the National Insurance flood program was administered and how development was actually being done within the floodplain, because they felt that it was degrading to the Endangered Species Act and didn't really enforce what the ESA was requiring within the floodplain. I don't know how the federal agencies really did battle on that one, but actually the National Marine Fisheries Service did win out and actually provided 3 options to communities that had floodplain dealing with the ESA. And through this ordinance, we adopted, basically the 3rd option was to deal with development on a case-by-case basis, that if there was development within the floodplain, they would be required to do a biological assessment. And in a sense, that took care of our requirements to meet that biological opinion. So that's encompassed in Chapter 1720. We don't really have to deal with that through this update of the critical areas. That's already been done. However, with most of the critical areas being encompassed in Title 20, there was little reference to frequently flooded areas in that title. So what I'm recommending, and you can see wording of that in your next packet, to add a new section 20.34, which is specific for frequently flooded areas, since that is one of the 5 critical areas that's being addressed. However, the impact of that chapter isn't very great. It will just provide a description and a purpose of frequently flooded areas, the classification, and then create the linkage to Chapter 17.20, where all of the regulations for flood prevention damage is encompassed. Any questions on frequently flooded areas?
I do have one. When it
Sure.
comes to the best available science, where do
Right.
we get that data from? Is it from the state, the state's Department of
Yeah,
Ecology, or?
That's a good question. It is the Department of Ecology that deals with floodplains, and they have issued that the new firm maps do represent the best available science. So with our adoption of the most recent firm map, we are in compliance with best available science. Good question.
Thank you.
Moving on to wetlands. This wetland, by the way, is not in the city of Oak Harbor. Just a point of clarification. Wetlands are administered by primarily the Department of Ecology. Back in 2005, we utilized the 2004 Department of Ecology guidance manual, which was prepared at that time. As part of this update, I thought it prudent to use both a 2014 version of the state model ordinance and an update in 2016 to deal with Department of Commerce's requirement to update the critical areas. So they basically came out with 2 documents. This chapter is seeing a lot of revision, but as a side note, it really doesn't impact the city that much because we don't have a tremendous amount of wetlands that we have to deal with. So we're fortunate in that regard. But what ecology is doing is coming out with a new rating system, since they have a better, and a lot of this is focused on maintaining functions and values of the critical areas. You'll see that as a constant theme through basically all of the critical area sections. Wetlands is no exception. based over the 12 years that they have a better way to evaluate the function of a wetland. They know, well, they say they know what protects them better. They also understand more of their functions. So with that, they came up with a new rating system, a new numbering system, if you will. Our old code is being revised from a numbering system that goes up to 100 to deal with one that is basically goes from up to 29. So it's a lot shorter of a range, and certainly when we get into more of the details in your packet materials, you'll understand what that is really trying to achieve. The one thing that they are incorporating in that new rating system, obviously, is habitat and how wetlands deal with wildlife habitat and the benefits that those two entities function together. Any questions on wetlands? Okay, fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. Again, this has been being proposed to be revised somewhat dramatically. However, again, it's based on Department of Fish and Wildlife's kind of restructuring of their view on habitat conservation. We are looking at, well, obviously using the priority habitat species again, which was utilized back in 2005, but they've gotten a lot more detailed. It's also a lot more user-friendly than it used to be. So we are incorporating that. Again, our species really haven't changed from the 2005 as far as what we need to pay attention to. But we are looking at a new description and purpose statement in this chapter. The DNR has come up with a new stream typing methodology, which we'll incorporate. Again, definitions, I mentioned those earlier in that chapter, have been reflected. And then there's some tweaking to our critical area reports that are recommended from the state agencies to incorporate into ours. And another key part of this is the delisting of the bald eagle. Before, we were very critical of bald eagle habitat, nesting areas, roost trees, those types of things. We still need to pay attention to that, but it's not quite as critical as far as maintaining a buffer around those certain areas. And in fact, the Department of Fish and Wildlife no longer is even engaged in administration of the bald eagle habitat. And the feds are requiring that developers actually do a self-assessment when they look at developing a piece of property.
Are there regulations in place for that?
Well, it's through the Bald Eagle Management Act and the Migratory Bird Act that really create that mechanism for the feds to do some type of regulation. So that.
But they actually don't come out then?
No, typically they will not come out. That's why they require a self-assessment be done on the properties. Any question on fish and wildlife habitat? Okay. Again, obviously, this landslide was not in the city of Oak Harbor. Just a qualification. Geologically hazardous areas. Very modest modifications. All of the materials that I have looked at refer to hazardous areas. Our 2005 update referred to sensitive areas. I'm making the recommendation we just change the terminology to the hazardous areas to be consistent with state requirements. Also in our 2005 update, the tsunami information that was provided by the state was inconclusive. We have better information now through the DNR Geologic Services Division that show some tsunami impacts along Crescent Harbor, which will reflect in our critical areas section for that. Relatively non-impacting, however. So any questions on that one?
Yeah, I do have a question for
Sure.
the bluffs and stuff, you know, about scenic heights and over at West Beach. Are we monitoring that, the erosions and stuff like that for future land use or property owners that they-
Yes. Our section that deals with steep slopes, potential landslide areas is in pretty good shape. So we'll continue to use that, but yes, we do monitor development when it's whenever it's in a landslide area or a steep slope area, we generally request a geologic report be done with any type of development.
Thank you.
Yep.
That's the Shoreline Management Act also?
Yes, that
Get
comes to
involved
play
in
in some of those areas as well. Yep. Okay, let's see. Critical aquifer recharge areas. That's one of those that you don't often see, but it's there, and it's one that the state has a high profile on. Basically, the entire city is within some type of critical aquifer recharge. And what we have done is utilize the county's information. Ecology deals with critical aquifer recharge areas, and identified two basic areas, a moderate and a high susceptibility to a recharge. That means the water flows through the ground pretty rapidly, or there's a high water table. The risk for contamination of that water is high. So we identify that. There's a very small area basically to the north of the city that falls into the high susceptibility area. But what we do is we regulate the land uses that occur on the surface in that vicinity. So we don't, anything that has a potential for spillage of a contaminant or fertilizers or oils or gases or something like that, we would regulate in that vicinity. So we're not changing that a whole lot, that section. Any questions on that one?
Can you share how that might impact, as we start looking at low-impact development and we're trying to mitigate stormwater on site? Is that going to play a role in the critical aquifer recharge area?
Well, yes, that's a good question. Actually, the state comes down and says low-impact development is a benefit in development near an aquifer, simply because it allows the water to infiltrate on site. It doesn't allow it to accumulate or pick up contaminants somewhere along the way. So it feels it's going to be more purified as it hits the aquifer. So it's a benefit. Good question. Okay, let's see, section 3, consistency. We need to look at what we're producing here to make sure that it meets the goals and policies that we've got established in the new comp plan, and also with the goals and policies that we have established in our Shoreline Master Program. You see attachment 2. I went through a pretty exhaustive effort to, first of all, identify the elements that deal with these critical areas, identify the policies, and then also address the policies. So you can take a look at that. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me, but it hopefully is self-explanatory. And that's just kind of a preemptive strike to a findings document, if you will. Let's see. We also need to establish consistency with our Shoreline Master Program. Obviously, critical areas in that shoreline jurisdiction, which is 200 feet from the ordinary high water mark, is of utmost importance for us. Basically, we want to maintain the character and the values of those critical areas. So what takes jurisdiction? The GMA through the Critical Areas Ordinance or the Shoreline Master Program? Well, in 2005, at that time, our Shoreline Master Program was a little outdated. The state says, well, you better use what you're creating now as part of this 2005 update to take jurisdiction over the shoreline critical areas as well, until you update your Shoreline Master Program. Well, we did that in 2013, and the state says, well, now you have the right through your Shoreline Master Program to regulate critical areas. Well, what we did in our 2000 Shoreline Master Program was basically reference the critical areas back in the GMA, our municipal code, Title 20, which is totally fine. We can do that. But that's what we did. There are some exceptions, as you see. The reasonable use and exemptions that are for building within the shoreline area is handled a little different. Variances are handled a little differently in the shoreline area than they would be in a regular growth management urban growth area. So Any questions on that one? Nope? Okay. Now, next steps. Tonight, we have the Planning Commission. We also have a review session with the City Council tomorrow. We have a placeholder for the May 17th City Council for review. I want to get very soon the proposed revisions into your packet so you have ample time to review that before your May 23rd meeting. What I intend to do is give you a strike-through underlined version from our code as it stands now to the proposed, and then do a clean version so that it's an easier read, and then you can pick things out that way as well. Prior to May 23rd, which I'm anticipating a public hearing and a Planning Commission recommendation, and then we want to take it to the June 20th City Council meeting for adoption. So with that, I would be happy to address any additional questions you might have. Okay.
It's a good
Thank you.
job.
Thank you.
It's a lot of information that you really have to dig into and go back and forth to. But it's part of the process.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. The next public meeting is the variances for the oak tree protection. Senior Planner Kat Kamak will walk us through this one more time.
Yes.
Kat?
Thank you. Kamak Senior Planner. This is a continuation of the topic that we introduced to the Planning Commission at the last meeting regarding just some of the challenges with our current code regarding variances for Gary oak trees. So just once again to kind of give a background to people that may be watching at home and to any commissioners that were not there at the last meeting, I'll go to a quick brief on why we're considering this amendment. So just as a background, we know the importance of Gary oaks to Oak Harbor, the namesake tree that gives Oak Harbor its name. Back in 1991, there was an ordinance 898 that was adopted to protect the trees. The ordinance was comprehensive and covered, a consultant was hired to do this, so they did a comprehensive coverage of it through an ordinance that had definitions and some prohibitions and trimming and variances. So they addressed generally how to tackle oak trees. And then there were some changes made in 2005, and some of the language that was adopted in 898 was kind of moved around in the code because in 2005 the city decided that the Gary oak can be covered under the critical area ordinance, just like every other habitat that we have, like in wetlands or similar nature. So, because I think there were some repetitive things that were being done. So, if the current code that covers critical area ordinances is similar to that which will protect the Gary oak trees, then why have duplicate language? And so in 2005, some of this language got dispersed throughout the code, and that's how some of our current codes were generated. But a section of the code that addressed variances was put into Title 19 of zoning. So that's kind of what we're looking at. That particular section in the variance section regarding zoning. So the original ordinance 898 had language for not requiring a permit for removing an oak tree if it was outside of the setback. So that was one of the things that changed from ordinance 898. I think the original code said if you had a tree sitting in the middle of your property, smack in the middle, and you wanted to build a house, you just could go ahead and cut it. No permit required. And I think that was a concern when they kind of shifted from the 898 to all the various things in the new code. And that was a concern. So they said, well, when they're going to the new code, they said, we got to be able to find a way to protect these oak trees. So, we should be able to shift the structure instead of just going ahead and cutting the tree. And I think that's where the language, kind of new language, was introduced other than what was in the ordinance 898 to say, okay, now you can move the structures. But I think there was some concern on how far these structures could be moved. And so they put a limitation on it, and they said you can't go farther than, or less than 5 feet to the side and 10 feet to the front. And, that code has been in place for a long time, and we've never had a situation or an application that came forward that actually tested that code. But today we do have an application, and we find that this setback limitation doesn't seem to make sense when you're trying to protect the oak tree, because every lot is different and every situation is different, and you should just look at what's on the ground and try to make things work, as opposed to dealing with these limitations that applies to all properties, and it may not make sense in some of them. So that's kind of the source of why we brought the code amendments forward. So we introduced this topic at the last meeting. At this meeting, what I wanted to do was to give you that actual strike-through version of the code, which is included in your packet. So what are we doing in terms of addressing this is, number one, let's remove the limitation. It wasn't there in 898, really, but we can see how it was generated through history. And it's better just to deal with it on a property-by-property basis. So we're proposing that these limitations be removed so that you can be flexible. And while we're in the code making changes, there are a couple of housekeeping items that we can change. So the current code refers to the Board of Adjustments, which I think was disbanded 20 years ago, or 2003, close, 15 years ago, 14 years. But the code was never updated since then, and we've had the hearing examiner in place for that time. So we want to just do the housekeeping and kind of change that while we're in that section. The other thing to clean up was, there's references to the planning director. At that time, it was called, the department that deals with this was called the Community Planning and Planning Development, or something like that. And so the title for the director was Planning Director. The department has changed, and we have a different structure now, and we have a director as opposed to a planning director, because the director oversees more than just the planning duties. And so we wanted to make that change as well. Just a couple of housekeeping items to add on to the proposed amendment. So we wanted to present this. This is just a public meeting. We wanted to share the document and get your comments and feedback if you have any. What we expect to happen is to have a hearing at the next meeting, so that will start the formal process. But we can take public comments. We want to take public comments throughout the entire process, but the public hearing provides another kind of official time when you can comment. And we'll have that in May, with the actual ordinance hopefully going to City Council if the commission makes a recommendation in June. So we can get that amended, and then we can get back to the original application that kind of initiated this in terms of the Rose Hill. We have a variance that's moving towards the hearing examiner to consider changing the house location in order to accommodate a Gary oak tree, and we want to make that work. So
How does that work, that there's an applicant now? Is that like put on hold?
yes,
Until-
yeah, yes.
Otherwise, would it not have been you folks that would have made some kind of a determination outside of the fact that we're rewriting or?
We would have had to have said that there would have been they would have had to meet the minimum setback as identified in the code, which then puts the oak tree in further jeopardy, or even shrinks the footprint of that house even smaller than what it's already been shrunk in order for it to work.
You don't have the latitude to trump that setback?
I don't, no.
Does
Because
the
there's a big,
examiner have that?
well, only the challenging part is that it says that under no circumstances shall it be less than, which is to my memory, the only place in the code where we say anything like that. So it's a hard and fast number that even there isn't the avenue of going to the hearing examiner, which is normally the place you go when staff lacks the administrative authority, right? We go to the hearing examiner because he or she, if it was a she, in a public hearing setting could consider all sorts of factors and then maybe make a decision that would be different than what the staff has the authority to do. In this instance, since it says under no circumstances, it's our collective opinion at the staff level that even he lacks the authority to modify that standard. And so what CAC is proposing to you this evening and what he's proposed before is a way which will allow staff and or the hearing examiner to consider the site-specific conditions and what's best in terms of trying to be able to preserve the tree.
Working with the lay of the land as it is.
And then just procedurally, if I may, our code actually addresses when there's a situation when we have what we refer to as two different types of review process, one being legislative like a code, and the other being something which is more project-specific. We then put the project-specific thing on hold, allow the legislative process to run its course, and then pick that project-specific application back up and continue processing it based on whatever answer comes out of the legislative process.
That was going to be the next question,
Yeah.
because I don't recall this happening too often.
It doesn't.
It's like putting the horse before the cart, or the cart before the horse.
In this case, the code allows us to have the horse and the cart standing side by side until we get one answer, and then we can finish the rest of the process.
Any questions?
So if I read this correctly, we've removed the setback of less than, and what you just said, in no event shall a setback be less than 5 feet. So that would open the hearing examiner up to make a determination that says we could go within 1 foot of a lot line as opposed to a minimum of 5. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Is this the time when we can take public comment?
Yes, please take
Laura?
public comments. Appreciate it.
Would you like to?
Okay.
Thank you
Well, the
for your
good
patience,
news,
by
yeah,
the way.
the good news is I'm looking forward to expressing myself and sharing what I've prepared regarding the oak tree protection. The bad news, if you will, is that I've learned the best time for this would actually be the public hearing at next month's meeting rather than tonight at the public meeting. So I'm going to ask for some forgiveness points from you. And if you could just pass back those packets, then I'll see you May 23rd.
Well, that's fair enough, Laura.
Thank you.
Yes.
But you got to learn about other cool plants.
Yeah, signs is always a good thing to have a little public discussion.
Ray, please note that she didn't refer to those as cool signs. She got to learn about signs.
Thank you, Laura. Any further discussion this evening about the oak tree variances?
I'll just point out for the planning commission and for my staff, where it says director, that almost always means or his or her designee. So just because they're singling me out doesn't mean that they're getting off the
Can't
hook.
pass the buck.
Yeah.
Okay, the last item this evening on our public meeting list is the park plan update. And once again, Kat Kamak is going to give us a brief walkthrough of this item.
Thank you. Good evening. I'll be as brief as possible. So, the park plan update, the commission is really familiar with updating plans. We updated the comprehensive plan with the 2016 update. And so this process should be somewhat familiar. So what I'm going to do, the best way to kind of start an update is to first talk about the existing plan a little bit. And what I'd like to do today is just to cover, I'm not going to try and cover what's in the plan entirely. It's going to take me about 2 or 3 meetings to do so. So we'll jump into some of the details more at the next meeting. But what I'd like to do at this meeting is to just kind of point out how the current plan is structured and why it is structured the way it is. So if you have an understanding of that, then it's you have a better way to find areas for improvement or areas of input that is most effective. So, it is an element of the comprehensive plan, and so one of the things that we'll do at the end of the, I know the commission is very familiar with the vision of the comprehensive plan because we went through an extensive process, at least some of the commissioners that were there during that process. We spent more than half a year going back and forth with that. And we do have a vision for the park plan as well, but as we talked about trying to defer some of the difficult questions to the park plan, we'll see if they are up to the task of tackling the vision. But I'd like the Planning Commission to also weigh in because the Planning Commission is familiar with the comprehensive plan vision, and the park plan vision needs to fit with the comp plan. And so I need your help and your review and guidance in comparing the two to make sure that they're in sync, and if there are things that need to be modified, we can do that. So why is the structure of the comp plan the way it is? It's designed specifically for the state's GMA requirements in terms of them requiring update. This was one of the first plans that I updated when I came to the city of Oak Harbor. And I came from a state that doesn't have growth management. And so things were done differently there. Plans are not updated as often in other states and other cities. They are long-range plans, and some of the plans are in place for 20, 30, or 40 years before they're amended. So when I came here and learned that plans needed to be updated every 6 years, that was for a plan that seemed fairly regular. And so it took a different approach to, how do you update plans? You structure plans differently, I think, where there's no GMA, and you structure them differently because you're going through such frequent updates over here. So one of the way the plan is structured is a tier approach, and I'll go through that a little bit. A plan includes long-term strategies, and when I say long-term, I think it goes beyond the 6 year. Even though the state says you have to update the plan every 6 years, the content in the plan is longer than 6 years. Some of them are 20, 30-year statements that you are ongoing implementation. Not all are intended for implementation immediately. Like I said, 6 years, it's a longer plan. And it can be adapted over time. That's kind of how the structure of the plan was designed to be. So what do we have? We have 3 tiers in the current plan. And tier 1 has some of it has the vision, it has a section called guiding principles, and this was a section, this kind of tiered approach was actually borrowed from the national parks. Some of the national parks also have to create these plans for management of their resources. And so we borrowed some of the structure from actually some of the national parks, and they have these guiding principles, which are usually contained in our goals and policies. And these are just standard statements that every community would like to have about their parks. It's about the quality of the parks and so on. And usually it's listed under the goals. And we thought that, these things don't change. You don't update them every 6 years. These are like kind of timeless statements that you talk about quality of parks. And it's better as a guiding principle and where it stays for a longer period of time and you're not continuously amending it. And then the goals and policy section, which you can look at every 6 years and see how you did, and if there were some issues in the last 6 years that were difficult to manage because the policy was saying something, and this is the time to look at it. And you can look at the goals and policies, which we should look at this update. And the recommended plan. Basically, you take every plan that we have, even our transportation plan has that, and they have an executive summary, the whole plan in 3 pages, basically what is it trying to accomplish. So that is tier 1 of the park plan, and was made to, if you took just tier 1 and said this is the plan for Oak Harbor, plan for the parks in Oak Harbor, hopefully it has enough information for people to get a general understanding of which direction the plan is going. So tier 2 is kind of like the workhorse of the plan. It has the strategic plan, it has the 6-year plan, what you want to accomplish in 6 years. It has the current conditions and the inventory of all our parks and how much area we have, how much playground equipment, how many basketball courts and how many tennis courts we have. So it has all of that. And then it has the level of service calculations, just like we have at level of service for transportation plan, we have the level of service for parks as well, and which is based on neighborhood parks and community parks and how much area they would, they should serve. That's kind of how we've adopted a system to look at that. And then we have what's called a level of attention. Basically, how are all these parks maintained? We know that Windjammer Park needs more attention because it's more of a community park. There's more people coming to it. There's more events, so that might need a lot more attention than, let's say, a neighborhood park sitting in the northeast of town, which serves a smaller area, and it's not necessarily a community-wide used park. That gets a different, we have to be able to assign our resources in terms of our parks division and how they maintain things, because we have numerous parks and we have a small staff. We have to prioritize, and that's just a tool on how to deal with those things. So if we have the pressure from a certain community, a certain area of the community for a different level of parks, you kind of look at that to see how you can manage resources. Do you need additional resources? Can we fund these additional resources? So that's kind of a tool that's in there. And then Tier 3 is administrative policies, and Tier 3 was created for the things that the Park Division does and what the Planning Department does when we consider developments and things like that. And these are kind of implementation policies, and these were things that were put in there so that you don't have to wait for an update to amend them. If there are things that it's just like an implementing code. If there are situations that come up that you want to make changes to something, you can kind of make it in the administrative policies side of things. So that's how the plan is currently structured. So that's the vision in the parks plan, and I'm not going to read it to you. I'll give you a copy of this when I get done with my presentation. The vision in the park plan, I should say, did not go through the same process that we did when we went with the comprehensive plan. This vision was not created with a collective conscience. It was just written to fit the plan as it was, because the previous park plans did not have a vision at all. And when this plan was adopted, we felt that it's good to create a direction and eventually try and hone the community into finding a good vision and going after it. So I won't read it to you, but it is in the Tier 1, and I'd like the Planning Commission to look at it and compare it with the comprehensive plan vision statement. I have copies of them, and that is kind of the task we'll take on at the next meeting, just to look at it. But I just wanted to put that up for people watching at home. What are the guiding principles? The guiding principles are, just a basic foundation for the users of the plan. Once they kind of, it's a general way to get an understanding of what the plan is based on. And if you read the principles, you get the right perspective, and so if you are a park board member, if you're a city council member, if you're a planning commissioner, you read the guiding principles, you get a better understanding of how to represent the plan when citizens are talking to you. You have a better feeling of what is the driving force on why we do the parks the way we do them. So that's kind of how the guiding principles are supposed to work. The comprehensive planning goals that are currently in there, they are a compilation of previous plans. I mean, when we did the park plan update in 2008, 2009 timeframe, we looked at all the previous park plans because we were kind of changing the format. We didn't want to lose anything. So all the goals and policies that are currently in there are 20 years worth of compilation of goals and policies. It's just not a 6-year-old plan that was adopted in 2009. There were some goals that were added in 2008, but not too many. Most of them are continuing. So goals are categorized in 2 different ways. They're either continuing. You can have a goal which is a continuing operation, that you always will have there. And some of them can be conclusive. It could be a project, complete the trail to Mailer Point. That was the goal. You finish it and you're done. maintain the waterfront trail as a premier, attraction for the city of Oak Harbor. That's an ongoing goal because you can use that continuously to bring projects forward. So goals can end. What can be the end results of goal? There could be a project construction, there could be property acquisition, or there could be some approval. So there's some end results that can happen based on your goal statements. They're also proactive or assistant in decision making. So these are the different type of goals that are in there. So when you're thinking about what you want to update in your plan, you kind of think about this. What do you want? Is there some new thing that we need to add so that we can make better decisions regarding parks? That type of stuff. And they're categorized parks, recreation, and open space. And we know that goals are different for parks, different for recreation, and different for open space. So they're categorized. All these goals are categorized. So that's kind of just the general, what I wanted to share with you. That's the Tier 1 and the structure of the plan. I didn't want to take up more time. I could go on forever, but we should take it in stages so that we can allow that information to soak in and continue discussion. So I'll come back at the next meeting and we can talk about the Tier 2 and the recommended plan. But what I'd like to share with you is I have a copy of the comprehensive plan and I've stapled a copy of the park plan vision so that you have both of them. Take a look at it and we'll talk about this at the next meeting and get your comments and thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And then that's all I had for today, and I'd be happy to, any questions, concerns, ideas, thoughts, anything that you would like to share with staff as we move or initiate this process?
Well, I suspect that the major thrust of all of this is going to be Windjammer Park through the different phases of development that we have discussed in the past.
Not necessarily. The Parks Plan is a larger document than the Windjammer Park Plan. Windjammer Park Plan, I would look at it as a subset or a sub-area plan within the Park Plan. That has gone through a process of hearing and public input, and that plan should stand by itself. We will try and make references from this plan to that and connect them to, but we're not going to try and recreate that process and try and somehow open it up for more discussion. It just stands by itself. It went through its process, right? So we kind of
Would we
want to
not
acknowledge
incorporate that, though, in the
Yes, we will.
overall park plan?
We'll make a connection to it, absolutely.
The neighborhood parks, a lot of them, I go walking through the neighborhoods and stuff, they're in neglect. Is there a plan to update those parks, get the community involved that service in that park area? Like in my neighborhood, I've been there for 25 years, and the park's deteriorating. The wooden benches need to be replaced. There's stuff that has to be done. Is there a plan for us to have local residents help the city maintain those?
I think our Parks Division do entertain local community, local areas participating and contributing towards the improvement of their park. We don't need any special statements in our plan to say that should happen. I think we already do have that. However, in the park plan, we do have the inventory of all the parks, and we list the improvements that are necessary for each park, whether it's the playground equipment that's old and need to be replaced, or picnic tables, or shelters, or whatever. So our current plan has the needs part of it listed. And then eventually when we get to the 6-year plan, we have to look at the funding, and usually we go, okay, we have a hierarchy. For City of Oak Harbor, for the population that we have numerous parks. I mean, compared to if you compare, and we did this comparison when we did the park update to other communities of similar size, the population to the number of parks that we have, Oak Harbor has a lot of them. So, so the Parks Division has to prioritize in terms of when the cycles of replacement can happen. And so it all based on funding availability and which parks come, which infrastructure gets replaced. So there is a list that cycles through in terms of replacing equipment. But there have been community projects done in the past, and I know when I got here, they did the Fort Nugent Park community build of the playground, where the community got involved in putting all that playground equipment together and things like that. So we do have existing programs. It's just a matter of, is there funding? Is that park up for equipment update during this 6-year plan? That's kind of needs to come in line in order for that to happen.
Thank you. Is there a way the public can have access to that, to know what the plan is for each of their areas? Is there a master plan that they can come and check out and say, I live in this area, this park is due for review or update at such and such time?
I have to ask our Parks Division if they have a list of the priority, or what's coming up. I know we have in our 6-year plan, we've identified certain parks that need to be addressed in that 6-year period. And then, when we go to the budget season, I know our Parks Division manager tries to include, pulls in these projects to add into the 2-year budget. But I don't know if he has a list for all the parks and when the cycle is coming through.
All right, thank you,
We can
Ken.
check
Appreciate
on
it.
that.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
I'd just like to point out along those lines, in the general section on page 16 of the comprehensive planning goals, they did mention in this last plan to try and develop new volunteer programs to improve those city parks. So it's kind of
Right.
along the same lines of what you were looking at. They were thinking about that. My question is, are there other parks within the city, maybe owned by homeowners associations, that are not listed on our city parks plan? They may be tot lots within a development or something along those lines. Is that going to be outside of the bounds of this parks plan update?
Yes.
And is there any kind of comprehensive list of those parks that are within the city?
I don't know if we have a comprehensive list. I know our subdivisions and so on, when we approve them, notify whether they're private or public, and we know those by just generally working with subdivisions, and we get calls on some of these parks, and we know they're private and owned by the subdivision and maintained by the homeowners. So we don't get involved in those improvements or in their use. We shouldn't be. I mean, that's kind of what they wanted,
I'm kind of curious, when I look at the maps that are included in here, there are large sections of our city that don't have very many parks as compared to other sections, and it would be interesting to overlay any HOA parks on here to see if there's larger clusters of parks in one area than in another. For instance, the southeast corner, as you go east and north of Smith Park, there's not a single park south of Whidbey Avenue and east of Midway.
Absolutely.
That's a corner of the area that doesn't have any parks, but when you get into the Fireside neighborhood or some of those newer subdivisions, we see a lot of clusters of small parks. I think it would be an interesting thing to explore. Where would our facilities be best used?
There is a map in there, and I don't have the park plan with me, so I wouldn't be able to tell you a page, but there is a map in there that shows the level of service and where there are no services for parks. And so if you look at the area east of Midway and south of Whidbey, we have no parks there. We consider streets to be major barriers. So would you send your kid, to a park across a major street? You probably wouldn't. So those are areas that are not serviced by parks. So we've identified those areas. Now, we have the school district property there, and there's always potential for, it being used for people, going for walks and things like that, and shared facilities. And we have some statements in the plan about trying to work with the school district to try and meet those service needs that we have in some areas. But then there are other areas we don't have that, for example, Scenic Heights. So if you look at Scenic Heights, south of 20 and along Scenic Heights Road, that's another section of the city that's kind of bordered by a lot of major roads and other barriers, and there's no parks there. So we've identified, there is a map in the current plan, and I think it's kind of colored orange and green, if I remember right, that identifies the areas where we think they are deficient. And so the goal there is, when an opportunity arises, it's good for the city to focus resources on there to try and get some service in there. And I think you're looking at that map right there.
I think we need to be careful with respect to what was just said. You know, there are large developments, or there's developments that we all live in that we're required to have parks, but those parks are not public parks because the HOA is responsible for the maintenance and everything regarding those parks. So we need to be cautious about, you know, putting that out there. I think in something like this, I mean, that's what my feeling is, because I don't want a large group of people coming in and tearing up the parks that me and my neighbors are having to pay for. The park department is being funded through general funds, okay, and they should be identified when they're developed. But when you take private money and just say that they have to put a park in there, an open space, let's put it that way there, that's just the feeling that I have.
Yeah, I think, I mean, our park plan, there was some discussion when we went through and listed the inventories, specifically to not include the private parks, but there was some discussion on whether we should include school facilities, because we were, in our level of service, we were showing some deficiencies in, with the national standards on some of the facilities we had, but the city council was okay with it because they felt that, the school district has facilities to compensate for that. So there's some understanding in the plan that, we use other public agency facilities to maybe kind of bridge the gap for our services, but we haven't taken into account any of the private parks.
Well, I think the key was public.
Yes.
So if I could comment on that, I think, at least speaking for myself, I understood Mr. Mann's comments to mean that it would be an interesting exercise to understand how certain areas of our city were served by recreational opportunities, be they public or private. Not necessarily that it would end up as a document or a map in the document itself, but just as an exercise to understanding how some areas are served. As a sort of a footnote to that, as I'm sure many of you are aware, and you pointed out some of the differences when we're on the east side of town, those are older subdivisions, 50s and 60s, and the planned residential development or the older planned unit development wasn't a development tool at that time. It was just plain old straight subdivisions, right? And as we transition into 70s, not so much, 80s, certainly the 90s and the early 2000s, now we see the more prevalent use of the planned residential development because it provides greater flexibility in how you lay out those subdivisions. The developer gets that flexibility in exchange for providing that common open space, because generally the private space is smaller. And so that's why when we're on the southwest portion of town, where we've got a lot of new subdivisions, you'll see more of those private spaces. And I think that's an important distinction, particularly maybe for the public to understand why we see some of those things in some areas of our community, and you won't see them in others. You will only see either public parks that the city has, or as CAC is talking about, maybe school district property that serves a dual purpose. So it's a function of time of development, I guess, is my point.
Any other questions?
I can see one thing, there can be a lot of changes to this plan, though, because, the city has done some other things. But it's all positive as far as I'm concerned. It's always a maintenance issue that I look at. That's, when I'm looking at any kind of a plan or a program itself, it's always a maintenance issue. And the level of maintenance that's given is what's the hot item for today, is what it amounts to, when things kind of get shuffled back. And that's the sad part, instead of being able to say, like, we discussed earlier, playground equipment that's broken and destroyed and hasn't been removed. It could be a liability in some respects. but the level of attention to it is not given. And that's the unfortunate part about it.
Yeah. And that brings up, and that's the tool, the level of attention is a tool. If you want to have more level of attention, that means resources need to
Right.
be also increased in order for that service to be delivered. And so that tool is just a vehicle for conversation, that when you do want to increase the level of attention, you should discuss the resources that will go along with it as well. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. So,
I see a reference in here to the 7th Avenue Wetlands tract. Is that city-owned property that is north of 7th Avenue? Is that what that's referring to?
yes, some of the, I think most of the wetlands, if I'm right, belongs to the city.
We own sizable portions. We actually have a 10-acre piece immediately on the north side of 7th Avenue where you've seen the sewer lift station sitting. Ironically, that's actually in the county, but it's ours. It's 10 acres that we own. And then farther to the north and a little bit west of that, we have a couple of tracts that were dedicated to us as part of the development process for those various neighborhoods in there. And then we have a little bit over by Coochie Street. So there is some public ownership and some private ownership.
Has there ever been any type of park development or any work happen in that property? Or has
No.
it just been a conceptual thing in this plan?
Conceptual point, CAC mentioned that one of the first things he worked on was updating the park plan. One of the first things I worked on when I came here in 1998 was conservation futures process to try to acquire some additional properties in the 7th Avenue wetland. Unfortunately, I was unsuccessful, not once but twice, but we have been the beneficiaries of some of these dedications. And so we still do have, I think as a long-term goal, recognizing that as our community continues to get bigger and densifies, having that significant size and feature in the middle of our community will become more and more important. So I think that's why we continue to reflect it in things like the park plan and the comprehensive plan. So I think that's it from staff tonight. I just sort of want to acknowledge for the Planning Commission, we had a big agenda for you this evening. Thank you. 5 sort of really different and varied items. So staff, thanks you for your time for that. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the staff as well. You've got all 3 planners on display tonight in terms of items for you. And you wouldn't have a highly organized packet if it wasn't for Lisa. Left to our own devices, it would not look like this. So I just want to thank all of the staff tonight.
I second that.
Yes.
Our next regular meeting will be on May 23rd, and there being no further business, I call this meeting adjourned.